For 26 years, my husband's family told me I contributed nothing. When he died, they handed me a prenup and a suitcase. Then I showed them who really ran the company. 9 days after my husband died, his brother sat across from me at the dining table I had chosen, in the house I had run for 26 years, and slid two things toward me. The first was a copy of the prenuptial agreement I had signed in 1998. The second was a folded piece of paper with a number on it, a settlement figure, the generous amount the family had decided I would receive to go quietly. And he said, "I know the timing feels harsh, Margaret, but it's clear to be clear now. A prenup is the prenup. The house, the business, the estate, that's all Ashworth money. It always was, and it goes back into the family. We've agreed a settlement that's honestly far more than you're entitled to, because Charles would have wanted you looked after." He tapped the number. "This will get you a nice flat, and you've had 26 very comfortable years, which is more than most people get." He almost smiled. "You did well marrying Charles. Nobody can take that away from you. You did well marrying Charles." 26 years, and my brother-in-law was congratulating me, 9 days after I buried my husband, on the cleverness of having married up. Let me back up. My name is Margaret Ashworth. I'm 58 years old, and I married into a family that spent 26 years teaching me, patiently and continuously, and always with a smile, that I contributed nothing, that I was a fortunate woman who'd married a wealthy man and been kept in comfort, and that everything around me, the house and the money and the life, was theirs and merely lent to me. When my husband died, they moved to make that lesson official. To enforce a prenuptial agreement I'd been pressured into, as a young woman, hand me a modest settlement and a suitcase, and put me out of the family the way you'd let go a member of staff who'd been with you a long time and grown too comfortable. The prenup was real. That was the trap that nearly worked, the same shape as all the others. I had signed it. It was legally sound. On paper, my brother-in-law was almost right. I was entitled to very little, and everything was Ashworth money. Except that for 26 years, I had been the one who kept the Ashworth money from disappearing entirely. Nobody, least of all me, had noticed, because the whole architecture of that family was built on the principle that what I did was not work and had no value. It took me a year, and an accountant nobody had ever thanked, and a note my husband had written me and hidden, to find out what I'd actually been worth the entire time. Let me tell you about the family first, because the Ashworths are the whole weather system of this story. Ashworths were old money of the fraying kind, the kind that has a large house and a family business and a great deal of manor, and that is quietly, terrifiably aware that the actual money is not what it once was. Charles's father had built, rather inherited, and then somewhat mismanaged a manufacturing business. There was the family house Renfield, which was beautiful and enormous and ate money, and there was an overwhelming unspoken family religion, which was that the Ashworths were superior, and that this superiority was located in the blood and the name and could not be acquired, only diluted. I dilute it. I was the dilution. I was a grammar school girl from Coventry, a doctor's receptionist, when I met Charles at a wedding when I was 31 and he was 35, and I was, from the family's point of view, a catastrophe wearing a nice dress. Charles's mother, Cynthia, on being introduced to me, said I heard her. She meant me to hear her. "Well, she's pretty, I suppose. Let's hope that's not the whole plan. Let's hope that's not the whole plan." The assumption from minute one was that I was there for the money. It never occurred to any of them that I might be there for Charles, who was kind and funny and lost inside that cold family and who looked at me like I was oxygen. It could not occur to them, because in the Ashworth religion, a woman like me had nothing to offer a man like Charles except the obvious, and the obvious was the money, and therefore I was a gold digger, and therefore everything that followed was justified. And so, when we decided to marry, there was the prenup. I want to describe the signing of that prenup precisely, because it's Act 1's hinge and it becomes Act 2's battleground. I was 32. I was in love. I had no money and no lawyer and no idea what I was doing. And the prenup was presented to me not by Charles. Charles was ashamed of it, I could see he was ashamed, but by the family solicitor. Dry man called Pemberton, who'd acted for the Ashworths for decades, in a meeting to which I came alone, because I didn't know I was allowed to bring anyone. And the document said, in effect, everything is Charles's and stays Charles's, and in the event of divorce or death, Margaret gets a defined and modest sum and no claim on the business, the estate, or the family assets. It ring-fenced Ashworth wealth. It was, I was assured, a formality, darling, everyone in the family does it, and also, in the same breath and without any sense of contradiction, a solemn firewall against exactly the gold digging they'd already decided I was doing. I was advised to take independent legal advice. I remember the sentence being said, and I remember thinking that getting my own solicitor to fight the document would be an act of aggression, would prove I was what they said I was, a woman angling for money, and so I waived it. I signed a piece of paper that Pemberton pushed across a table, in a room full of people who decided I was a thief, precisely because I wanted so badly to prove I wasn't one that I gave away every protection I had. That is how they get you. The prenup was designed to catch a gold digger. The only kind of woman who'd sign it without a fight was a woman who wasn't one. It filtered for my innocence. My willingness to sign away everything was, to me, proof of my love, and to them, merely the successful closing of a defensive transaction. We signed the same document meaning opposite things, and 26 years later, their meaning was the one with legal force. Now let me tell you what I actually did for 26 years, because this is the inventory that the word contribute nothing was designed to erase. Let me give you the daily texture of contribute nothing, because it was administered in tiny doses, and the doses are the story. It was Cynthia, my mother-in-law, at every Christmas for 26 years, complimenting the meal I had shopped for, cooked, and served by saying, to the table, "Mrs. Hedges must be a treasure, Mrs." Hedges being a cook we had not employed in a decade, the compliment sailing past me to a servant who no longer existed, because it was easier for Cynthia to credit an imaginary member of staff than to say that Margaret could cook. I stopped correcting it around year 8. Learn? It was the way at family gatherings the conversation would turn to money, investments, the estate, the business. And the men would drift to one end of the room, and it would be understood without a word that this was not my area. That I was decorative, that talk of the family's fortune was talk among Ashworths, and I could go and see to the drinks. I who was, at that exact moment, in year 12, secretly rescuing the business they were pontificating about. I would carry a tray of my own husband's brandy to a circle of men congratulating each other on Ashworth resilience, and I would say nothing, and pour. It was Charles's sister, Diana, who once, watching me deal briskly with a builder about the Renfield roof, said, meaning it as praise, which was the worst of it, "You're so wonderfully capable, Margaret. It's marvelous, really, how you've taken to all this. I suppose it's a very different world from what you were used to. A very different world from what I was used to. I was, at that point, running a listed building and turning around a manufacturing company. The world I was used to had produced the only competent adult in the family. But in the Ashworth grammar, there was no sentence in which my competence was anything but a charming adaptation, a clever pet who'd learned to fetch. It was Charles's own unconscious participation, which hurt most and which I have had to forgive, because he loved me and it was still true. Charles, who knew what I did, who depended on it utterly, even Charles and company would say, "We're very lucky, Margaret keeps us all organized," as though I were a good diary, as though 26 years of labor were a pleasant knack for tidiness. He didn't mean it the way they did. But he'd been raised in that grammar too, and the grammar had no words for what I actually was, and so even the man who loved me described me, in front of his family, as a helpful sort of clock. 26 years of that. Not one great blow. 10,000 small ones, each individually deniable, each one, if you objected to it making you the unreasonable one. Margaret, it was a compliment, until the accumulated weight of them had built inside my own head. Permanent quiet voice that agreed with the family. That I was lucky, that I was decorative, that whatever I did was a hobby, that the money and the name and the life were theirs, and I was a guest who'd been allowed to stay a long time. I raised the children. We had 2, Alina and Thomas, and I raised them essentially alone in the way of that class. Charles was present and loving, but the labor was mine, and it was not the labor of a woman with staff. Because the Ashworth money was always tighter than the Ashworth manor admitted, and I did far more myself than anyone outside knew. 2 children raised into functional, kind adults. That was work. In the family's ledger, it was nothing. It was what mothers do. It was instinct. It was not a contribution because it could not be invoiced. I ran Renfield, the house. And running a large old house is a genuine job. It is estate management. It is staff and contractors, and the endless war against damp and roof, and the costs of a building that is always trying to fall down. Charles's mother had run Renfield by having opinions about it. I ran it by doing it for 20 years, and I ran it well. And I ran it far more cheaply than it had ever been run. And the family experienced this as the natural orderliness of things rather than as the output of my labor. Invisible work is like that. When it's done well, it looks like nothing is happening. The better I ran Renfield, the more it looked like Renfield simply ran itself, and the more I looked like a woman being kept in a nice house. And this is the one that matters. This is the buried treasure. I ran the business. Or I saved it, at least. And I need to tell you that story properly, because it's the whole third act. Ashworth business, Ashworth & Sons, a manufacturer of specialist components, the source of all the family's fraying grandeur, was, by about the 10th year of my marriage, quietly dying. Charles had inherited it, and Charles was not a businessman. He was a lovely man who'd been handed a company he didn't understand and was too proud and too frightened to admit he was losing. And in about year 11, in the middle of the night at the kitchen table, broke down and told me the truth, that it was months from collapse, that he'd been hiding it, that if it went, it would take Renfield and everything with it, and that he didn't know what to do. And I, the doctor's receptionist from Coventry, the delusion, the woman who contributed nothing, I said, "Let me see the books." I had no formal training. What I had was sense and nerve and a capacity for work and an outsider's willingness to ask why things were done the stupid way they'd always been done. And over the next 3 years, quietly, without title or credit or salary, I effectively turned that company around. I renegotiated with suppliers. I found the divisions that were bleeding and cut them. I identified the one product line that actually made money, and I bet the company on it. I dealt with the bank. I sat unofficially in meetings that Charles could not navigate. I briefed him beforehand on what to say, and I fixed it afterward when he'd said the wrong thing, and slowly, painfully, the company came back. And it came back enough to fund the next 15 years of Ashworth grandeur. School fees, and the roof at Renfield, and the family's continued ability to believe itself wealthy. Let me give you one night from those 3 years, because it's the night I understood what I was actually capable of, and the night I understood I would never be allowed to say so. It was the bank meeting, the one that would decide whether Ashworth & Sons survived to the end of the quarter. Charles was to go alone, as the owner, the man, the Ashworth, and Charles could not do it. I found him in the study at 11 the night before, gray, a whiskey untouched, and he said, "I don't understand the covenants, Margaret. I don't understand what they're going to ask me, and I don't understand the numbers well enough to answer. And if I get it wrong tomorrow, we lose everything, and it's my father's company, and I've killed it." And he wept, my proud, kind, hopeless husband, at his own desk. And I sat up with him until 4 a.m, and I taught him his own company. I built him a single sheet, the numbers that mattered, the answers to the questions they'd ask. The one line of argument that would work. And I made him learn it like lines in a play, and I rehearsed him the bank manager's likely questions and his replies over and over until he could hold it. And in the morning he went in and he performed it, my script, in his good suit with his good name, and the bank held, and the company lived, and Charles came home and put his arms around me and said, "You did that. Every word of that was you." In private, only in private. And 2 weeks later at a family dinner, Charles's father, still alive then, raised a glass to Charles for steering the ship through choppy waters and showing the Ashworth backbone, and the whole table drank to Charles's backbone. Charles caught my eye across the table, and there was an apology in it, and I smiled and raised my glass to my husband's backbone, which was a single sheet of paper I'd written at 3 a.m. That was the night I understood the exact shape of my life, that I would do the work and the name would take the credit, and that the arrangement was so total that even a toast to a man's courage was really a toast to his wife's. No one at the table would ever know, and I would help them not know, because the alternative was to shame the man I loved in front of the father who frightened him. I saved the source of their money, and I did it as a ghost, because Charles, he knew, was too ashamed to say his wife had rescued the family business. It would have meant admitting he couldn't, and the rest of the family never knew at all. I let it be invisible because I loved Charles, and I didn't want to shame him, and because being needed by him in secret was its own kind of intimacy. So the family's central article of faith, that Margaret contributed nothing, that everything was Ashworth money, was not just false. It was precisely inverted. A significant portion of what they called Ashworth money, the money they were now moving to protect from me, existed because of me, and they didn't know, and I'd let them not know for love for 15 years. You can see, I hope, the shape of the disaster I'd built. I had done the most valuable work in the family and arranged for it to be invisible. I had signed away my rights to prove my love. I had spent 26 years being told I was worthless and had, out of love, hidden every piece of evidence to the contrary. And then Charles died. Charles died of a stroke at 61, suddenly with no warning, and this is the detail that unlocks everything, so hold it with no will, or no findable will. He had always said he'd sort it, that I was protected whatever the family thinks, that I wasn't to worry. But when he died, no will could be found, and without a will, the prenup and the intestacy rules and the structure of the Ashworth assets all combined to do exactly what the family wanted. And the family moved with a speed that told me they'd been ready. 9 days. 9 days after he died, his brother Gerald, the new head of the family, the keeper of the flame, sat me at my own table and handed me the prenup and a settlement figure and, in effect, a suitcase. The house was to go back to the family. The business was Ashworth and Sons and reverted to Ashworth control, meaning Gerald's. The estate was Ashworth money. And I would receive the modest, generous prenup sum, and I would leave Renfield, and I would be, after 26 years, exactly what Cynthia had always insisted I was. A woman who'd married Charles for the money and was now, the money having done its bit, going home. Gerald was not even cruel about it, and that was the worst part. He was gracious. He was doing me a kindness in his mind. He genuinely believed the family story, that I'd had a good run, married well, been kept comfortably, and was now being sent off with more than I deserved. He said, "You did well, marrying Charles." He meant it warmly. He was congratulating the gold digger on a career well managed, at her husband's graveside, and he thought he was being nice. And here's the thing I have to be honest about, because it's the real subject of this story, underneath the money. Part of me believed him. 26 years. 26 years of being told, in 1,000 small, gracious ways, that I contributed nothing, that I was lucky, that everything was theirs. It works. It gets inside. You cannot be told something pleasantly, daily, by everyone around you, for a quarter of a century, and not come to half believe it, even when you know, factually, that it's false. I knew I'd saved the business. I knew I'd raised the children and run the house. And still, sitting at that table with the prenup in front of me, some deep, trained, worn-down part of me thought, he's right, though, isn't he? It was Charles's money. You didn't really earn any of this. You've had a comfortable life you didn't pay for. Take the settlement and be grateful and go. That's what contempt does when it's patient. It doesn't just insult you. It recruits you. It makes you the final, most reliable enforcer of its own verdict. The most effective person telling me I was worthless by year 26 was me. I want to sit inside that for a moment, because I think it's the part of my story that will be most familiar to people who have never lived anywhere near a house like Renfield, and I don't want to rush past it for the money and the reckoning. In the weeks after Charles died, before I found the note, before Frank rang, I did a thing I'm ashamed of. I started privately billing the case for the family. Lying awake, I would rehearse their argument and improve it and find myself nodding. Well, the house was Charles's, wasn't it? And the business was his father's before him. You only helped. You didn't own it. Helping isn't owning. You did have a comfortable life. Other women would have loved that life. Who are you to complain that a comfortable life came with some slights? And the prenup, you signed it. Nobody forced your hand. An adult woman signed a document. That's on you. And on, in the small hours, my own mind doing the family's work for free, more thoroughly and more cruelly than Gerald ever could, because Gerald didn't have access to my every private doubt, and I did. That's the true horror of being told something patiently for 26 years. By the end, you don't need them in the room. You carry a small, fluent Ashworth inside you who can win the argument against your own worth before breakfast. When Gerald slid the suitcase across the table, he wasn't persuading a resistant woman. He was collecting an agreement I'd already, in the dark, half signed. And I think that's why so many women in my position take the suitcase. It isn't that they can't see the injustice. It's that the injustice has been living in their head, as a lawyer for so long, that fighting it feels like fighting themselves. Stand up and say, I'm owed. I would have had to evict a tenant of 26 years standing, and I was so tired, and grief makes you tireder. And the Lauder's voice was so reasonable and so familiar and sounded so exactly like good manners. So when Gerald handed me the suitcase, I very nearly picked it up. I nearly took the settlement, the nice flat, the going home. Not because I believed the prenup was fair, but because I had been so thoroughly taught that I deserved nothing that fighting for something felt like proving I really was the grasping woman they'd always said I was. To fight was to confess. To go quietly was to remain, at least, a lady. And being thought a lady in that family had been the closest thing to acceptance I was ever offered, and I didn't want to lose it even as they threw me out. What made me hesitate just long enough was my daughter. Alina was 24. And when she heard what Gerald had done, the table, the prenup, the suitcase, 9 days after her father's funeral, she drove to Renfield and she was incandescent in a way I had never seen, and she said, "You are not taking that settlement. Mum, you are not." And I said all the tired things, the prenup's watertight, it was Daddy's money, I've had a comfortable life. And Alina looked at me with something close to horror and said, "Do you hear yourself? You saved the company." "I know you did," Dad told me. 2 years ago, he told me the whole thing. He said, "Your mother rescued this family and never got a word of thanks, and I'm going to fix it." And now you're sitting here reciting Uncle Gerald's lines like they're facts. What have they done to you? What have they done to you? That was the first crack of light, and on the strength of it, I got a solicitor. She was called Fola Adebio, and she did high-value matrimonial and estate work, and she was exactly the kind of formidable I needed. And I told her everything, and she said, "Right, first, the prenup." Prenups are not automatically ironclad in this country. The court retains discretion, and a prenup can be set aside or departed from, especially if it doesn't meet needs, or if there was pressure, or no independent advice. Second, and much more powerfully, have a claim based on your contribution to the marriage and the assets. A wife of 26 years who ran the home, raised the children, and by your account rescued the business has a very substantial claim regardless of the prenup. Because the law recognizes non-financial contribution as equal. Margaret, they cannot just hand you a suitcase. This is not the 1950s. Let me get the prenup file and the estate papers and let's see what we're dealing with. And for a week, I had hope. Real hope. And then Fola got the prenup file, and her face when I next saw her was careful. She said, "I have to be straight with you because it's my job. The prenup was done, I'm sorry to say, properly. That's the problem. Pemberton's file is immaculate. It records that the terms were explained to you. It records that you were advised in writing to seek independent legal advice. It records that you declined that advice in writing and signed a waiver. There's a letter, signed by you, confirming you understood the agreement and were signing freely." She turned the file toward me. There was my 32-year-old signature on a letter I did not remember signing, confirming that I understood I was giving everything away and was doing so of my own free will. They were careful, Fola said. Whoever structured this knew exactly what makes a prenup vulnerable, and they closed every gap. No pressure on the face of the record, the opposite, a documented offer of advice that you declined. Full disclosure of assets attached. Your signed acknowledgement. Catherine, she caught herself, Margaret. As a document, it is about as strong as these get. A court could still depart from it on the basis of your needs and your contribution. That door is open, and it's a real door. But the prenup itself is not going to be torn up as invalid. It was done properly, they made sure. The false victory again. I had walked in believing the prenup was a piece of bullying that any decent court would ignore, and walked out learning that it was a beautifully constructed legal instrument, signed by me, freely, with advice offered and refused, in my own hand. The one document that could sink me was watertight, and I had made it watertight myself, at 32, out of love. And the family, sensing through the solicitors that I was wavering, improved their offer slightly and attached a deadline and a warning. Fight this. You'll spend years and a fortune in legal fees you can't afford against a family that can try to overturn a prenup you signed freely. And you'll lose, and you'll have spent your settlement on lawyers. You'll have confirmed to the world that you were exactly the grasping woman we always knew dragging the family through the courts over Charles's grave. Take the money, be a lady. Go. I had the settlement deed in front of me, and a pen. And I was, God help me, going to sign it, because 26 years had taught me that being thought grasping was worse than being poor, and because some ruined part of me still believed I'd earn nothing and deserve less. 2 things saved me, and the first was a man named Frank Okoro. Frank had been the accountant and, latterly, the informal finance manager for Ashworth & Sons for over 20 years. He was the person who, more than anyone alive, watched me save that company, because in those 3 desperate years in the middle of my marriage, Frank was the one professional in the building, and I had worked alongside him night after night, and Frank knew exactly who had turned that company around. Because he'd handed me the figures and watched me act on them while Charles sat pale in the corner. Frank rang me when he heard I was being pushed out. He said, "Mrs. Ashworth, I've heard what Gerald's doing, and I've been an Ashworth employee for 22 years, and I've kept my mouth shut about a great many things, but I'm not keeping it shut about this." He paused. "You saved that company. I was there. And I want you to know I kept the records, not because I ever thought this would happen. Because I'm an accountant and I keep records, and because I thought, one day, somebody ought to be able to prove what you did, since nobody was ever going to say it out loud." He took a breath. "The board minutes from those years. Restructuring proposals in your handwriting, Mrs. Ashworth, or typed up from your notes with your name on the drafts. The supplier renegotiations, which you led. The emails. There's a complete documentary record, in this company's own files, of the wife who wasn't allowed to have a title running the turnaround that saved the Ashworth fortune. And Gerald's about to stand up and say you contributed nothing to Ashworth money. Frank's voice was very dry. I have 20 years of evidence that the Ashworth money he's trying to protect from you only exists because of you. The turnaround was documented in the company's own files. Every restructuring proposal, every renegotiation, every strategic decision, attributable, datable to me. I had made myself invisible for love, but Frank Okoro, doing his boring, diligent job, had kept me visible in the one place I'd never thought to look, the corporate record. And the second thing was the note. And the note is the reason I can end this story the way I want to. Because Alina kept saying, Dad told me he'd fixed it. He said he'd sorted it, that you were protected. He meant it, Mum. Where would he have put it? And there was no will. We'd searched. The family had searched. Believe me, the family had searched. Charles, my Charles, was a private man who did not trust his own family. He'd learned not to, watching them, and it was Alina who thought of the one place. Charles's study at Renfield had a small wall safe that the family knew about and had already been through. But Charles also had, in the study, an old first edition of a book his grandfather had given him, a book he loved, that no one in that family would ever open because none of them read. And inside it, Alina found an envelope, in her father's handwriting, addressed to me. It was not a formal will. Charles, characteristically, had drafted a proper will with a solicitor but had died before executing it, which is its own grief. But it was something a court cares about enormously. It was a clear, dated, handwritten statement of his intentions, and crucially of the promises he'd made me and the facts he was recording. It said, Margaret. If this is being read, then I've gone and left it too late to do properly, and I'm sorry, I always thought I had more time. So let me say it plainly, in case my family try what I think they'll try. You did not marry me for money. Or the reason there is any money. In 2009, you saved Ashworth and Sons. You not me, I couldn't have done it, I was drowning. And I let you do it without credit because I was ashamed, and that shame is the great regret of my life. Because it let my family go on believing a lie about the finest person I've ever known. The prenup was a disgrace, and I should have torn it up 20 years ago. Whatever the law says, and whatever Gerald says, the truth is this. Half of everything is yours because you built it, and the other half is yours because I love you. I am telling my solicitor to make it right. If you're reading this because I ran out of time, take this to a good lawyer. It is my statement, freely made, in my own hand, that Margaret Ashworth is the author of the Ashworth fortune and the whole of my heart. Make them face it. Charles. For the reason there is any money. My husband knew. He'd always known. And he'd carried the shame of his own silence, and he'd meant to fix it, and he'd run out of time the way people do, but he'd left me the truth in his own hand. And in a book his family was too incurious to open, because he knew them, and he knew what they'd do, and he did the one thing a dying man could do to protect his wife from his own blood. It came to a mediation, because of course it did. Gerald and his solicitor on one side, secure behind the immaculate prenup, me and Fola on the other with a letter and a note. Gerald opened graciously, as ever. The prenup, Ashworth money, the generous settlement. The families wished to avoid an ugly and pointless fight over an ironclad document, for everyone's sake, for Charles's memory. And Fola let him finish, and then she went to work, and I want to tell you how it felt to watch, after 26 years of being told I was nothing, someone lay out in a cold professional voice exactly what I had been. She said, let's begin with the premise your client keeps stating, that this is all Ashworth money and my client contributed nothing to it. I'd like to enter these. And she put down Frank's records, the board minutes, the restructuring proposals in my handwriting. Supplier renegotiations I'd led, 2 decades of a company's own files. In 2009, Ashworth and Sons was months from insolvency, which would have taken Renfield and the entire family estate with it. It was rescued. A documentary record of that rescue, the strategy, the renegotiations, the decisions, is in Mrs. Ashworth's hand and attributable to Mrs. Ashworth throughout. The company's own long-serving financial controller is willing to testify to it. The Ashworth money your client is seeking to protect from my client substantially exists because of my client. She is not a claimant against the Ashworth fortune. She is, on this evidence, its principal author. Gerald's face had begun to change. He hadn't known. He genuinely hadn't known. None of them had, because I'd hidden it, and Charles had hidden it. And now it was landing on him for the first time that the woman he'd handed a suitcase to had built the thing he was standing on. As to the prenup, Fola went on, yes, it was competently drafted, and we do not dispute its execution. But the court retains full discretion to depart from a prenuptial agreement where it fails to meet a spouse's needs or to reflect her contribution. My client's contribution, 26 years of homemaking, the raising of 2 children, 2 decades, running the family estate, and the rescue of the family business, is in law of equal standing to any financial contribution, and here it is also unusually itself financial. No court in this country would enforce a modest prenup sum against a wife of 26 years who saved the very assets in question. The prenup is not a wall. It is one factor, and it is outweighed. And then she put down the note. And finally, Charles Ashworth did not execute his final will before he died, but he left this, a dated, handwritten statement of his intentions and of the facts found in his study. She read it. She read the whole thing in that quiet room in her level voice. And when she reached you are the reason there is any money, I watched Gerald look for the first time in 26 years, as though he were seeing his brother's marriage, and his own family, clearly. She finished, Margaret Ashworth is the author of the Ashworth fortune and the whole of my heart, make them face it. Fola set it down. Charles asked us to make you face it, so shall we discuss a settlement that reflects the truth? Or shall we go to court where I will put 20 years of company records and this letter in front of a judge? Where the story that emerges will be the story of a family that tried to hand the woman who saved its fortune a suitcase 9 days after she buried her husband. The room was silent for a long time. And then I said the only thing I said. I looked at Gerald and I said, "Your mother told me the day I met Charles, let's hope that's not the whole plan." She meant the money. For 26 years, all of you believed I was here for the money. I put my hand on Charles's note. "I saved your money, Gerald. In secret, for free, because your brother was too ashamed to say his wife was clever than him, and I let him keep that dignity because I loved him. You spent 26 years being kept afloat by a woman you were sneering at. And the only reason you'll ever have to believe it is that Charles hid the truth in a book, because he knew none of you would ever open one. It settled properly because once Fola had laid out the letter and the note. Gerald's own solicitor will have told him what mine told me in reverse, that fighting on was catastrophic, that a court would depart from the prenup comprehensively, and that the family's dirty secret, that they'd lived for 15 years on the labor of a woman they despised, would become a matter of public record if they forced it. I did not take everything. I want to be clear because it matters to who I am. I did not want Renfield. I never wanted the mausoleum. I'd only ever wanted the man in it. I took a settlement that reflected my contribution, a substantial share enough that I will never again be a woman being told she's lucky to be kept. And I let the family keep the name and the house and the fraying grandeur they cared about more than they'd ever cared about me. I took what I'd built. They could have the rest. Gerald and I do not speak. He has never apologized, though I understand he no longer says the thing about the money, which in that family is as close to an apology as the tectonic plates get. Cynthia, my mother-in-law, died 2 years later, and I did not go to the funeral, and I felt nothing about that at all, which after 26 years of wanting her approval was its own strange liberation. But I did not get the 26 years back. And I have to tell you the truest and least satisfying thing about this whole story. The money was never the wound, and the settlement never healed it. The wound was that they made me believe them. For 26 years, I did the most valuable work in that family and let myself be told it was nothing. And I so internalized the telling that, when they finally moved to throw me out, my first instinct was to agree with them and apologize for the inconvenience of existing. No settlement refunds that. I will spend the rest of my life catching myself in the reflex. The automatic deference, the readiness to believe I've earned nothing, the trained flinch of a woman taught for a quarter of a century that her worth was a favor being done to her. Frank Okoro I kept in my life. I asked him, once, why he'd bothered. Why a busy accountant kept 20 years of records proving the contribution of a woman with no title who no one would ever ask about. And he said, because it was true, and true things should be written down, in case a day comes when everyone decides to pretend otherwise. I've watched a lot of powerful families rewrite their own history, Mrs. Ashworth. The books are the one place they can't. He shrugged. I just kept the books honest. That's the whole job in the end. The books are the one place they can't rewrite it. Leaner and Thomas are grown, and they know the truth now, all of it. The business, the note, the suitcase. And Alina, who found the letter in the book, said something to me that I've kept. She said, Dad hid the truth about you inside a book, because he knew they'd never open one. That's the most romantic and the most damning thing I've ever heard. He loved you enough to leave you the proof, and he knew his family well enough to know exactly where they'd never look. She held my hand. You're not a favor they did, Mum. You never were. I watched you my whole life. I always knew. I always knew. My daughter always knew. Somebody in that house had seen me the whole time, and it turned out to be the child I raised, and that, more than the settlement, more than the reckoning, is the thing I got to keep. Here is the last thing. They spent 26 years telling me I contributed nothing, that everything was Ashworth money, that I was a fortunate woman being kept. And the terrible efficiency of it was that I helped them. I hid my own contribution out of love. I signed away my rights out of a desire to prove I wasn't grasping. I even, at the end, tried to enforce their verdict on myself, reaching for the pen to sign the suitcase settlement, because being thought worthless had become more comfortable than the fight to be seen. But my husband knew, and a quiet accountant knew, and my daughter knew, and between the three of them, a note in a book 20 years of honest letters. A young woman who refused to let her mother recite her enemy's lines, I was handed back the truth about my own life, which is the thing they'd actually stolen, the money being only the symbol of it. I did not marry Charles for the money. I am the reason there was any money. He wrote it down in his own hand and hid it inside a book because he knew the one thing his family would never, ever do was open one and look for the truth. They never opened the book. I did. And it said, in my husband's handwriting, the sentence I'd waited 26 years to be allowed to believe. You are the reason there is any money. Make them face it. I made them face it. And then, slowly, harder than any of it, I made myself face it too, that I had been, the whole time, exactly what they swore I wasn't, and nothing at all like the woman they, and finally I had been so sure I was. Not a favor. Not a fortunate girl who married up, not the delusion, the author. It was in the books the whole time. I just had to be nearly thrown out with a suitcase before I let myself go and read them.